some announcements first, but when you, we're going to go through the presentation and then we're going to give you an opportunity to ask questions. At that point, we'll ask you to mute or unmute yourself, and we want to try to keep the lines clear, so just one person speaking at a time that's unmuted. You've all probably been doing lots of Zoom calls these days like the rest of us, or team calls like this one is. So I think most people have the routine for how it goes, but feel free to ask questions, or if you're having any trouble, let us know. I'm Sheila Kloefkorn. I'm one of the co-chairs of the Arizona Technology Council MarTech series. My co-chair, Susanne Lake, is on as well. You can see her wave, Susanne. And we're really excited to bring you this presentation today. A couple of announcements. So if you're an Arizona Technology Council member, these MarTech series events are one of the committees of the Arizona Technology Council, and we meet every other month or so. We normally meet in person at Galvanize in downtown Phoenix, but for the foreseeable future, we're going to be doing these on a virtual basis. So we're excited that you can join us. Our next one will also be virtual, and we're in the process of confirming that topic and speaker right now. But today we're excited to have the opportunity to talk a little bit about internal communications. So as you know, in your companies, there's been a lot of change in the last few months. Many of you are pivoting your brands, your messaging externally to your prospects and customers, but many of you have large organizations, and you've also had a challenge with how do you communicate those changes to your internal groups, whether they be in other countries or other states. Many of you are working from home. Most of you probably are working from home at this point. And so we thought it was a great opportunity to talk today about internal communications, especially in this age of COVID. And we have two speakers. Susanne Lake is going to kick us off today and talk a little bit about what's been happening at Blue Cross Blue Shield. And from there, she's going to introduce Neil Goldstein, who's going to talk a little bit about what some other large companies are doing. He's with a partner of Blue Cross's, Poppulo. And we're just thrilled to have both of them here with us today. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Susanne to kick us off, and then she's going to introduce Neil. But thanks for joining today.
Yes, and it's Neil Lieberstein.
Oh, Lieberstein. Yes, sorry.
So hi and welcome. And unfortunately, Blue Cross Blue Shield wanted to join and they couldn't. As I'm sure it's been crazy for all of you, for a health insurance company to be a communications person at this point in time with everything going on is also very difficult. I can speak very directly, though, to Blue Cross Blue Shield of Arizona, as they've been a client of mine for several years. And I've been working with both their internal and external marketing teams. When I started working with them a couple of years ago, I was working with external marketing at the time. And one of the first things that kind of struck me about the company was they are very employee focused, and not just their own employees, but even contractors and anybody that they're pulling into their fold. The communication is unbelievable. And I hadn't seen a company, and I've been in a lot of different companies helping them out with their systems. I had not seen a company do as good of a job as Blue Cross was doing. And so I think that, some of that is, well, most of it is just the communication and how they're joining the different departments across the board together. And one of the key pieces to that is an internal newsletter that they do. They send 2 of these out a week, and it's called the Blue Buzz. And they're using it as a platform to bring together communications for HR and what's going on, the upcoming reviews and things that they need to prepare for, as well as some of the internal programs that they run. They have a volunteer group called the Cares Club, and so they'll talk about what events they're working on and how they're raising money or doing volunteer activities. And employee spotlights, and being a health insurance company, health and wellness is really important to them. So they'll feature exercises and recipes and ways to stay fit, and and very relative to what's going on. So for instance, right now they would be talking about how do you stay fit when you're stuck at home all the time, and what can you do, and to bring that wellness into your life. And then in addition to their newsletter that goes out a couple times a week, they have regular emails from Pam Kahili, who is the CEO, and other functional groups too, like even the security team. Here's some phishing type messages we've been seeing, and there's just a lot of communication going across the board. And they've been using, for the last several years, they've been using a platform called KEO Marketing. And KEO has allowed them to kind of start to get some analytics around the data. And I think that's been really key for them. They get like anomalized statistics about what type of topics people are engaged with, which departments are more engaged than others, which locations. And then they use that to help drive content for the next time. And so it's been very important. And one of the things that I would say that has been really critical to them in that whole process is making sure that the data is anonymized. There's a lot of liability that goes into when you start working with and looking at employee data. So they've always made sure that, by looking at some trend or, what's going on, that they couldn't point out a single person and know that, what activities they're doing, particularly if it's like around some health article or something, that you may not want to divulge, and it could be considered private health information. So they're very, very in tune with that, and that's been one of the critical pieces that they look at. Is we want to be able to glean this information in the same way that you would an external marketing campaign to know how to drive future content, but at the same time respecting your employees' privacy. And then more recently, they've made an investment into a platform called Poppulo. That's where Neil is from, and they're kind of carrying forward some of the same great things that they've been doing, and they're moving it over to Poppulo. And the primary reasons why they're making the change is ease of use. And Poppulo has some very cool tools, such as pushing out employee surveys, and some social media type aspects to it, like you can like an article and just gets people more used to a feel that they're used to on their online personal life. And so it's a very comfortable place for them to go and get their information. And by no means is it anything that they call complete. They're still learning, they're still evolving. But I think that it just really goes to show how much they view their employees as their greatest asset. And they make that investment into their employees, and it pays off for them. And so, I'm really, really happy to have Neil here today. And Neil, thank you for agreeing on such short notice. Neil has this great overview of a lot of different industries and what's working right now. And he's got some great stories to share. So Neil, I'll let you take it away.
All right. So, thank you, Susanne. I appreciate it. Can you all hear me okay? No echoes?
Sounds great.
All right. Sounds good. So as Susanne said, I represent Poppulo. We are an employee communications platform. About 1,000 customers around the world. Those customers use us to reach over 20 million employees through kind of what is, I think, one of the industry's only dedicated, focused employee engagement, employee communications platform. So we tend to work with a lot of large organizations, but we have a fair share of small and mid-sized enterprises as well. So enough of the commercial. We move to the next slide. Fantastic. You don't need a whole lot more about me. I run marketing for Poppulo, but I've worked in everything from startups to a stint at a 200,000 person organization when I had one of my startups acquired. So I've seen communications from where you can, meet someone over the water cooler and everyone would fit in one room, all the way up to the other extreme. And kind of the communications ocean has really been the focus of what I've done. So what I thought I'd do in maybe 15 or 20 minutes is just give you an overview of the best practices that we're seeing from our customers as to what have they learned over this last probably 3 months or so. Kind of COVID-19 has really turned many of our worlds upside down, and the employee communications function within those organizations, wherever it lives. Sometimes it lives in marketing, sometimes it lives in HR, sometimes it's standalone. But wherever it lives, they've spent some time drawing some lessons learned from the last 3 months, because there are going to be a bunch of changes going forward. And whether we turn the corner and we're out of the woods for good over the next couple months, or whether it's kind of a chutes and ladders games where we get farther down the road and then slide back and kind of reimpose some of the social distancing and things that we've been experiencing right now. They're trying to get ready for that. And one thing, let me just, Susanne, comment on something that you said that isn't on my list, which I think is a foundational item. And that is, the best of our customers treat their employees as if they were customers. They treat them as another core constituency, because they've figured out that the more their employees are part of kind of the environment that they're sharing with their customers, the better job they do in serving those customers. And so taking some tips from the marketing team in terms of surveying their employees, as you mentioned, what are the issues that are on their mind, understanding not just kind of what they're looking for, but what they're feeling. And so letting the emotions come through, because that's something that they need to deal with every bit as much as they do with external customers or prospects. Targeting them in terms of what does each group care about, because different groups of employees will care about different things. And especially in the kind of crisis milieu that we've just gone through and may continue to go through, people can get a sense of just being overwhelmed if there are too many communications. And so finding the balance of who needs to know what, who's looking to know what, at which point in time, is something that external marketers are very familiar with. And the best of our customers are doing that internally as well. So a couple lessons learned, a couple stories. The first lesson that we're hearing from many of our customers is make sure you partner with your HR teams, because kind of the employee experience at this point in time is intimately tied up with HR. And being able to partner with HR, making sure that you understand kind of the messaging that HR is sending out, and that you align your communication. So again, employees don't feel they're being spammed by multiple departments, each sending out multiple communications, is kind of one of the first big lessons that people have taken away. The next one is the ability to be agile. And being agile in terms of communications often depends on your organizational structure. Some organizations are very centralized, others are very decentralized. The centralized ones that have kind of a broad footprint, whether it's in multiple states or multiple regions or multiple countries, have been challenged to be able to react quickly to differences in local situations. And what they found is they've had to act more like decentralized organizations. And one of our customers, Tech Data, is a good example of this. You know, they started out as a very, very centralized organization and quickly realized they're an international organization. They've made acquisitions in Asia Pacific as well as Europe. And they quickly found out that when headquarters sent out something, and headquarters is in Florida, when they sent out a communication, it wasn't tremendously relevant to people in Europe or to people in Asia Pacific. And so it didn't take them very long to realize that they needed to empower their local teams to act in as a coordinated a fashion as they can with the corporate team, but they had to give them a lot more autonomy in what the message is, when to deliver it, what channels to use to deliver it, than they were used to using. And it took them probably about 2 months to get it to a point where they've now got a balance between what goes out centrally from the central communication group and what goes out locally without having to secure approval every time a message goes out. And so the same way that that software developers have developed an agile methodology for writing code and getting product to market, Tech Data represents a group of folks who have kind of realized they need to do the same thing from their communications perspective. Another lesson learned, and this is one that another one of our customers, Encompass Health, really personifies, is helping executive leaders not just step up, and communicate in the normal way that they've done with the organization, but to really get to a whole nother level in understanding what's on employees' minds and figuring out how to not just reassure them, but to level with them, to tell them when they don't have answers to everything, to tell them that there's bad news coming, but just kind of the role of the employee communications team, has really shifted from being a channel for leaders to share the messages that those leaders want to communicate, to really helping guide the CEO, the COO, the CHRO, anyone with a C in front of their title, helping them understand what employees are thinking and feeling, what questions they have, helping them figure out which communication channels are things that they want to be thinking about using. For example, there are many execs who just are not comfortable with video, and yet, from an employee standpoint, video is clearly one of the more effective ways of getting a message out. And so they've had to make them feel comfortable. They've had to help train them. They've had to kind of get them out of their comfort zone, help them measure the results of what the communications are, and then regroup and to say, okay, these couple messages are getting through, these aren't. And Compass Health runs, I think they're the 4th largest organization in the country around post-acute care. So they run rehab units and they run nursing homes. So they're right in the eye of the storm right now. And the internal comms team there has really helped their leadership get to a whole new level of communicating with employees and creating a two-way dialogue with them. Next lesson, over communicate is probably a simplistic way of saying it. There's a tendency we found, according to our customers, for kind of the executive team not to want to say anything until they know what the answer is. And they're much more comfortable taking an issue back, studying it, looking at it from every side, and then when a decision is made, then communicating that down into the organization. And the COVID-19 situation does not work that way, has not worked that way for most of our customers. They've heard loud and clear from employees that they want to know what's going on, even if they don't have the answers. And they don't want it sugar-coated. And so this notion of, I don't want to, say too much, or I don't want to say anything until I know what the answer is, has really fallen by the wayside during this initial, first 3 months. Now we're starting to see that change a little bit. We're starting to see the communications shift from only COVID-19 types of content to, where that was, if we look across our 20 million employees, that receive comms through our platform, there was this huge spike starting around March, and probably 70 to 80% of the comms that were going through were pandemic related. We're starting to see that shift back now to about 50-50. And we expect to see that trend continue. So what we're seeing is a change, not so much in the frequency, because communication teams are now, if they would send out something once a week, they're sending it out 3 times a week now, but the content has shifted. Susanne mentioned kind of being able to measure kind of the impact of communications at Blue Cross and Blue Shield. And one of our other customers, McDonald's, really has become very sophisticated at doing that. And what they've done is they've factored in not just pulse surveys, and other ways of quickly measuring what people are feeling, but they've gone through and said, here's kind of the emotional arc that we expect people to go through. It's almost like kind of the emotional response when a crisis hits, where people tend to be in denial first, and then they'll start to get used to it, and then they'll kind of start to feel a little better, and they may go downhill a little bit. McDonald's kind of sketched out what that kind of that emotional journey was for their employees and their franchisees, and then created content geared to each of the major phases of that emotional journey. And they have that content ready to go on an individual by individual basis, based on the measurements that they're doing through our platform. They can tell, who's opened what, how long, how much of something have they read or listened to, kind of have they taken the actions that have been suggested in those communications, and based on that response data, they can direct content to them that's appropriate for the emotional stage that they're at. Next slide. Thank you. So one of the big lessons that many of our customers and people that we're talking to now that are looking to put kind of an improved employee communications infrastructure in place, one of the big lessons that we've heard is be ready for the next crisis. Because if you don't have that infrastructure in place before you need to use it, it's usually too late to have it be effective. And by infrastructure, it's not just kind of technology like the kind that that we create, but it's also the processes in place Who's going to respond to what? Whose role is it to take each of the different steps? One of our customers, Wentworth Institute of Technology, kind of 4,500 students, 500 staff, located in Boston. The students went out on spring break in the middle of March, and they didn't come back. And in 2 weeks, that communications team, working with the administration, was able to flip the entire university from both the learning perspective and the internal operational perspective, from in-person traditional academic situation to a virtual learning and a virtual working environment. And one of the reasons they were able to do that is because they had a very strong communications infrastructure in place already. Students, faculty, staff were all used to getting communications through this platform. And so there was a high degree of trust that they associated with communications coming through that platform when this crisis struck. And having that in place, having it tested, they would do quarterly kind of drills, just making sure that everything worked well, making sure people knew where to go, who was responsible for what, was a huge asset to them in being able to respond quickly from a communications aspect. Another healthcare customer of ours, Valley Health, kind of a smallish chain of hospitals in Virginia and the surrounding states, about 6,000 people, right on the front line of responding to the COVID-19 pandemic, had in January begun a rollout of a mobile app that we had put out earlier in the year to supplement kind of the more traditional communication channel. So they had been doing an email newsletter for multiple years, and they had that down pretty well. But they realized that more and more of their both providers and their staff were not able to get to a dedicated computer, whether laptop or desktop, during the day, and they were looking for a different way to communicate with them. And mobile was an obvious choice for them. They ran through a process that took them about 2 or 3 months to vet the technology, organize the communication contributors, who was doing what, test out, get some folks in to look at the user interface, look at the data, what they were going to put on there. And they started to roll this out in January. They expected it would take them about 6 months to get the first 1,000 subscribers to this mobile app for kind of company-wide communications. And by the middle of February, they were about 3,000. So it just showed to them there was a real appetite for using mobile as a communication channel. And then COVID hit, and things went through the roof. And they were kind of by happenstance, the timing was perfect for them. But what they found was that people would be checking that mobile app for communications on a daily or twice daily basis, because they could carry it around with them. They had kind of structured the content to make it really easy for people to get to. And they actually made an interesting strategic decision. They kind of took a whole different path in terms of targeting content. Instead of just saying, here are the frontline docs, they need this information, the nursing staff needs this information, the back office teams, the facilities people need this information. They shared everything with everyone. And the rationale was they wanted the frontline folks to know that they had a support team in back of them, and they wanted the back office people to really feel what it is that the frontline folks were experiencing. And they got tremendous feedback in a very positive way on that choice that they made, because it kind of brought everyone together, not as individual silos within a healthcare institution, but as a single organization that was helping the frontline folks care for patients in a time of real disruption. The last kind of lesson learned that I'd like to share with you is, as things have started to open up, if we've moved beyond just the kind of initial crisis response phase, what we're seeing is many of our customers thinking and planning that pivot in a strategic way. They look at it as kind of a major change initiative. And what we've learned as communicators around change is you need different things when you're communicating long-term major changes than you do when you're just sending out weekly updates. You need to understand what's the vision that the organization is choosing for itself and why. You need to understand what everyone's role in that is. You need to understand that this is not something that's going to be a short-term effort, and once it's done, you can stop talking about it. It really has a very long tail to make people feel that they understand that. And so kind of the work that they're doing around that is not just communicating how are we going to get back to where we were in January, because it's going to be business as usual. They're approaching it as, we don't know what the new normal, to use a very overused phrase, we don't know what that's going to look like because we're not there yet. We know that over the next 3, 6, 9 months, there are going to be a bunch of changes. And at that point in time, we may learn kind of what the world is going to look like for us from an employee engagement perspective, from a business perspective. And so we're going to bring the employee communications team together and be part of that group that is planning out how are we going to, kind of re-engineer our operations, how are we going to re-engineer where people work and how they work and who works where. They're baked into this planning at the beginning, and they have a very strategic role in both kind of providing input into the decision-making process, and then communicating the results of that decision-making process out, and giving people, kind of creating a two-way dialogue together with HR, with other parts of the organization, back up to the leadership team. So I've talked at you for much too long. Let me stop there, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you have. Oh, I think you may be on mute, Suzanne.
Thank you, Neil, so much for that. It was a great presentation. Certainly your point about taking a pause to think about internal communications in addition to all of the marketing that we're doing to external groups is really important. We have quite a few people on the line, and we have more than enough time to take questions. So if you have a question, you can click the raise your hand, the little hand button, and Lee is going to unmute folks, or maybe you can unmute yourself, or you can put your question into the chat. Jill wants to share that you've shared some great content, Neil, so thank you for that. I think the stories that you're sharing are really helpful because they give us some examples that we may be able to use to augment our own communications. There's a question, love what you said. Certainly want employees to be more engaged with internal communications and get them involved. Is there anything else in terms of frequency and trying to break up the message for them? Any other nuggets that you could share about, a lot of this ends up happening via email, and we have, as Susanne mentioned with Blue Cross, folks doing twice a week emails. Do you think there's a rule of thumb about frequency or way to do it to even just get started?
I'd say the very first thing you can do is actually ask your employees. We tend to overlook that step very often, and they'll tell you. If you ask them, they will tell you how often is too often, how much is too much. We've seen our customers go from kind of once a week kinds of things to daily at the beginning of the crisis because things were changing that often. They've probably moved back to about twice a week now. But this is one of those, it depends. It depends on the size of your organization. Are you all in one place geographically? So you don't need to address different regional concerns because things are happening differently in different regions.
Do you see more companies using text messages, especially if they have remote employees or first responders? Or
so the remote employees and first responders, some are using text, a lot are using mobile. I mean, mobile really becomes we're so used to it.
And by mobile, you mean a dedicated app for their employees?
A dedicated app, because it allows you kind of a really rich array of formats. It can be as simple as text. It can be images, graphics. It can be video. It can be live video or recorded video. And so that mobile platform really is coming into its own. That we're seeing that. We're seeing a lot of people looking at that. We've done some of our own webinars on this. And when you ask people kind of what are you looking at now to get ready for kind of the next wave of whatever happens now, mobile is a big thing. So if you're not looking at that together with email, this is what our customers are telling us they're looking at.
So Suzanne, and to a certain extent, you brought up that it's important to talk about how all of these changes are impacting employees' lives, and then also to share changes in strategy for the business. Do you think that there's a best practice mix of how much of one versus the other so they don't get overwhelmed with COVID emails or messages, those kinds of things?
So what we're seeing now is organizations saying to their employees, kind of, here's how we're structuring the planning for, getting back to this next phase, whatever that is, whether that's long-term or it's 6 months in length, and then we'll see. So they're actually sharing kind of, here's where we want to get to. Here are the criteria and that we're going to use before we make a change. Here are kind of the things that we're thinking about. What do you feel? So they're involving people in not just, here's the answer. And it was a black box on how we got there. They're really opening it up and giving people insight into kind of, here are the principles that we're going to use. Here are the kind of the criteria, and whether it's kind of what the CDC says or it's what we've determined. And you can read these things in the news. So famously, Twitter has said, we're not going to ever require anyone to come back to an office before. if they don't want to. So what we're seeing best practice is sharing the journey that the senior leadership is on, not waiting until you have the answer to it to communicate that something is happening. We're starting to see people kind of on the other path reintroducing, here's what's happening in the business. So kind of moving back toward a modified normal of the things that they had been communicating before, and those are almost on two different time scales.
Yeah.
They're the normal communications are happening back at that once a week, twice a week kind of frequency. The strategic ones are getting shared as they happen, and we've seen from a really tactical perspective, you've seen different branding on each one. So
for the strategic stuff.
The strategic one may come with a headline, in a different color, in a different font that says, "Pay attention to me." So again, kind of going back to the things that have proved so effective for external marketers, applying those internally.
We've seen with some of our clients that those have been some of the most effective when they're being communicated in real time almost, but also allowing employees to ask questions. So for example, like Apple, if they're deciding to do split shifts moving forward as they go back to work, there's all kinds of questions about, well, what do I do if my desk is too close to the next person, and kind of those kinds of things. So do you see more people allowing for those collaborative questions, or doing those more through these types of Zoom or Teams meetings?
So we're seeing kind of two different levels. What we're seeing is people asking employees, what do they feel comfortable with? And they'll do it either through a survey or kind of a social media oriented kind of thing where you can like or dislike a thing, but it's almost like a series of trial balloons. If we use these criteria to allow people to go back in the office, would you feel comfortable? If not, what would make you feel comfortable? Where do you draw your own line? We're seeing a lot of interactive communications around that.
Yeah, it was something as simple as that question. What would you feel comfortable with? I think that's
right.
The simpler, the better.
Yeah, along the same lines, Neil, are you seeing more use of your survey tool?
Yes. Yeah. We are. We are. The survey tool, we can see different kind of volumes of things going through our platform. The survey tool has taken off because it's a really easy way to get your finger on the pulse of who is feeling what. And again, for companies that have employees in different geographies, you have to do that because you have to be able to target them and to understand who's feeling comfortable around what.
Thank you. I have another question from Suzanne, but before we get to that, if there's something that your company has done really well that you'd like to share with the group, would you please put it into the chat? We'd love to share best practices across everybody on the call. And Suzanne, I think you had a question about security, so why don't you go ahead with that one?
Yeah, so I was just wondering, Neil, if the security concerns are greater on the mobile app than they would be over, like, say, an intranet that is secured.
So we spent a lot of time with a lot of our high security customers. So we have a lot of the big banks, we have a lot of the pharmaceutical corporations, people who are essentially regulated industries for whom security is huge. So we've engineered security into that, and actually don't tell anyone. The security investigations, the due diligence that the kind of the internal technology people in the security space do on the different parts of the product has gone down recently just because they're so overwhelmed. And they'll say this is more important, and that may be changing now that things are getting a little bit more under control. But we've got all the ISO certifications. We've done all the kind of things that the security guys want to see. So we've tried to do that for them. And then, as I said, we haven't had any problems on the security perspective. They ask, but, we, and I'm sure, lots of other vendors like us have gone out of our way to make sure that that's an easy test for them to do it. And we continue to have outside organizations, do intrusion kinds of things. So we keep up, the kind of testing that will make, the big banks and the insurance companies and the pharma companies and the kind of the hospitals and healthcare organizations, who have all the same issues that so well from Blue Cross Blue Shield. They need to make sure that that data is protected and that their networks are protected and that we're not going to bring down something. So, long-winded answer that, that's a big deal for us.
Yeah, great. Other questions from the group? I know a few people had to leave, I think, because of the noon hour, and we're double booked, so many of us now on these types of calls. But here's one more question. What are the top 3 things CEOs overlook when communicating with employees? Could you give us a sense of any of those?
Sure. The top one that we hear a lot is CEOs tend to be very polished. They are used to presenting to boards of directors, to outside investors, to sophisticated major customers. That's not the side of them that employees want to hear. They want to know what they're feeling. They want to get a sense of the authentic person behind the robe, behind the suit. And so the coaching that our customers are giving to their leaders is it's okay to be vulnerable. It's okay to be human. It's okay to empathize with people who are going through some hard times now. And you don't have to have all the answers. So
hopefully that's something that stays with us after this.
You hope so. You hope so. And the other thing that we hear from the CEO, from the communicators who are talking to the CEOs, they really are out of their comfort zone right now. They're not used to working from home. They are not used to being out of the environment where they can control, most of the aspects of it. And so they need reassurance that it's okay if they're broadcasting from their living room or from their home office, and they don't have to put a suit and tie on to do this. And they don't have to pretend that, they're addressing an investor community that expects them to behave in a certain way. It's taking them a little while to loosen up a little bit about that. And that's a big role that the employee comms people play for the executive team, that it's okay. Here's what people really want. And, it's okay to be yourself. You don't have to, put up the image that you need to put out in other circumstances.
Really good points. Any other questions from our audience? Neil, your feedback's been really great, so thank you.
Oh, thank you for the chance.
Yeah. Well, I think our main point is that internal communications is equally, if not more important right now in a time when employees and team members are experiencing unprecedented change. So many of you I know are already doing this. How could they get in touch with you if they have questions, Neil?
So they can send them to you if
Mhm.
they know you and you can forward them on, or you can send them to me at it's N Lieberman, Lieberman at Poppulo.com.
Great. Thank you, Neil. The MarTech series meets about every other month. We'll have more information for you coming up soon about our next virtual event. We're going to stay virtual for a while. Jill, is there anything you want to say about other upcoming Arizona Technology Council events?
No, I think just you can visit aztechcouncil.org/tech events and see all of our upcoming events. We have some diverse events, whether it's IoT or MarTech like today, or workforce development, which is this afternoon. So we have a variety of virtual events, and they are all free for members.
Great. Thank you, Jill. Thanks, Lee, for hosting us. Thanks, everybody, for joining today. We're going to end a little bit early because we didn't have lunch this time, but hopefully at some point in the future, we'll be back having lunch. We sure appreciate your time and your participation with the MarTech series, and we'll be back to you soon. Thanks for the Arizona Technology Council hosting this, and thank you, Neil, for your great information, and Suzanne for yours about Blue Cross Blue Shield. Have a great day.
Bye.
Bye-bye.